As Barbara mentioned, we have now 3,000 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation. They were all hit over the head by a figurative 2x4 upon hearing about this information, which we had not heard from our mainstream media. Some of them are here today. Would those of you who have signed our petition as an architect or engineer stand and just, we'd like to honor you. Well, here's 1 and 2. Awesome. Ross Muir, structural engineer. Bill Bernier, architect. New York, thanks guys. We just honor you. World Trade Center 7, as Barbara said, was not hit by an airplane like I was on that day I heard David Ray Griffin. I really did. I was just in shock. I had to pull over in my car, and I'm going, what am I hearing? Here's this old man, right? He doesn't sound like he has any axe to grind, but he's telling a completely different story than what we heard that day. He was telling us about World Trade Center Building 7, half the height of the Twin Towers, a football field away north of the North Tower here, part of the World Trade Center complex. Wasn't hit by a plane, but 7 hours later, it went down too. At 5:20 in the afternoon, here it is, having survived the other 2 Twin Towers. Let's just take a look at what happened to this building. Let's just jump right into it. East penthouse falls first. 6 seconds later, this happens. You know, most architects and engineers know nothing about the 3rd worst structural failure in modern history. Not until we tell them at the architecture and engineering conferences. NIST comes along 7 years later and says, hey folks, I know this is the first high-rise that's ever collapsed due to fire, but guess what? It came down due to fire. What? It came down due to fire? What fires? These fires. These are the worst fires that we have photographic or video evidence of in these buildings. They're few, they're small, and they're scattered. So I've been tasked to give you a half-hour summary of this evidence, which I'm going to try to do. It's 4 hours of information. And guess what? The fires have never brought down a skyscraper, even much larger, longer lasting and hotter fires in these buildings. Not in Los Angeles, Philadelphia, or Caracas, Venezuela have we ever had a high-rise come down before 9/11 due to fire. We do have something that can bring high-rises down due not to fire, but by setting pre-placed explosives in these buildings. This is called controlled demolition. There's only a handful of companies around the country that can, around the world in fact, that can do this. It's an art, it's a science, it's engineering. It's very difficult to do. You can't do it by setting a few small scattered fires around the building. There's a set of features associated with these controlled demolitions, and I want to show you because it turns out that Building 7 has all of these features. Beginning with, is there a sudden onset of destruction at the base of the structure? Let's listen
high shots
to Dan Rather.
Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Describe that. Now we go to videotape the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the 3rd time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
That's intuitive. Thank you very much, Dan. We appreciate that. A 7-year-old can figure out what's going on with these buildings. It's not that difficult. Am I right, Ross? It doesn't take a structural engineer. But it took me 5 years. How long did it take you?
It took me 13 years because I thought they were going to look at the dust.
Yeah, they have all kinds of things they tell us. But this one came down, straight down into its own footprint. Take a look from West Street. Feature number 2 of controlled demolition. The main penthouse drops first, a half a second prior to the overall building. What does that mean? That means the supporting structure underneath that main penthouse and screen wall have to be removed all at once, all 24 of those columns, so that that penthouse can fall. That completely violates NIST's theory that the column instability started under the east penthouse, traveled laterally across this football-sized building in 6 seconds, the time from the east penthouse fell to the time the overall building fell. and into its own pile. Yes, the center of the building is in the center of the footprint, but I'm not quite sure yet. Let's compare side by side. Building 7 on the left and known controlled demolition on the right. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never brought down a skyscraper. Should have been the first, if not the only, serious hypothesis to be considered. But it wasn't seriously considered. How do we do that? How do we bring a building down symmetrically? We have to remove all 80 columns virtually at once on each floor, synchronistically timed. Otherwise, the building begins to tip over. And there are plenty of failed, controlled demolitions that do exactly that. These fires are not going to do that. At this point in our presentation to architects and engineers, they get it. Their knees start shaking. They get dry mouth. They start quivering. And they shut up and they listen because we've got them. This building fell at free fall acceleration. How fast is that? That's this fast. 3, 2, 1. Fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky. But wait, there was 40,000 tons of structural steel supporting this building before that happened. And suddenly, it's not there anymore? What happens to that? NIST acknowledges that it came down at free fall acceleration after having been publicly embarrassed by members of AE 9/11 Truth in their technical conference, and they had to admit it in their final report. But they don't admit the implications of that. What are the implications of a free fall acceleration? It's that there was no structure. All of a sudden, section B in this diagram is removed, allowing the building to come down for a third of its 7-second fall in free fall acceleration, resulting in the total dismemberment of the steel structure. Here's a moment-resisting steel frame structure, 40,000 tons, where the columns and the beams are rigidly welded to each other. All of a sudden, they give up. Every one of them. Because you have 47 stories compressing to about 4 or 5 stories, like a house of cards. This doesn't happen in natural building collapses. In natural building collapses, we have a recognizable building at the base. The structural members are not severed one from the other. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. We don't have sounds of explosions heard by witnesses. What? Let's go back to the official story. No evidence of explosives. Did you look? No, we didn't look for evidence of explosives. This is a year later in writing. They actually acknowledge that. You can't find what you're not looking for, but we have plenty of witnesses that describe explosions, and we have explosions themselves. Just moments to share with you. Let's jump to the Twin Towers because we've got to go on. Does it have a sudden onset like Building 7? You tell me. It's there, and then immediately it drops. There's no hesitation, there's no jolt, there's no impact, and it just does what it does when the structure is removed so that it can fall suddenly. The South Tower, same thing. Watch. It's there, and then suddenly it begins to fall straight down. We'll talk about how fast that's coming down in a moment. First, let's see, do we have any patterned explosions? Are there witnesses of explosions, flashes of light? Graham McQueen researched. In 2005, we finally learned that we have 500 first responders that were recorded in September and October following 9/11. And we didn't know about this because the city held this information, but finally we learned, and it's on the transcripts, and we have 118 of these firefighters talking about sounds, hearing sounds of explosions, experiencing explosions, seeing flashes of light, many of them, like this one. We felt the ground shake. You could see the towers sway, and then it came down. Hey, the ground is shaking, and then the towers come down. All of a sudden, the ground just started shaking, felt like a train running under my feet. The next thing we know, we look up, and the tower is collapsing. Not the tower collapsing, causing these sounds, causing these vibrations, but vice versa. Listen to these witnesses.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
Was that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
That was the
Planet probably?
Yeah, definitely secondary explosion.
I heard a second explosion and another rumble.
An hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower.
It just went ba-boom, it was like a bomb went off, and another explosion came right from it, because everyone flying.
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. There were continuous explosions.
No, the first explosion, then there was a second explosion in the same building. There were two explosions.
Okay.
Federal agencies that were down there do believe that there was some sort of explosive device somewhere else besides the planes hitting.
There was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. So obviously, according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
It goes on and on and on. There's 100 of these examples, first responders and others. It shook my bones. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground shaking, heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. Well, there's other witnesses, like the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, which picks up these signals. Well, how do those signals relate to what's happening in the towers? We have the first plane impact, by the way. There's plane impacts that were picked up, and there's signals associated with around the time of the collapse. But the first plane impact, we have the seismic event occurring here, but guess what? The plane doesn't actually impact the building until 14 seconds. What are we talking about here? The seismic event picked up the signal prior to the plane impact. How can that be possible? Well, this corroborates the witnesses that you're going to see of explosions even before the plane impact. A lot of people don't know this. And we have a lot more detail on this particular set of research in our webinars, which you can find on YouTube for free. The second plane impact occurs here. The plane impact doesn't occur until 17 seconds later. Here's William Rodriguez, witness.
I was a janitor. Like I said, on that day, there was an explosion on the basement, and this is prior to the building got hit by the plane.
Prior to the building that got hit by the plane. There's two other witnesses.
I was a janitor. Like I said, on that day, there was an explosion on the basement, and this is prior to the building got hit by the plane. And then the plane hit.
I think a bomb went off in the lobby first, then a plane hit the building.
The bomb hit the lobby first, and a couple of seconds in the first plane hit.
So these witnesses know. NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people, how and why World Trade Center 1, 2, and 7 collapsed, but they stopped, in the case of the Twin Towers, at the initiation of collapse. No analysis whatsoever after the collapse starts. This is what structural engineers do every day for a living. Let's look at the building collapses themselves. The signal starts here, but the building, the main debris, the first debris doesn't even strike the ground till 7 seconds later. How can that be possible? Well, we have explosions again prior to the buildings actually collapsing. That's what you heard those witnesses talking about. Same with the North Tower, where we have the event starting here, and 4 seconds later we have the actual heavy debris hitting the ground. So it doesn't make sense. And so we have Andre Rousseau, author of 50 peer-reviewed papers on applied mechanical geophysics, doing this incredible research here that NIST failed to do and did fraudulently in the case of the analysis of the seismic events. We felt the ground shake. You could see the tower sway, and then it just came down. All of a sudden, the ground just started shaking. Felt like a train. Take a look at the North Tower on the right, a known controlled demolition on the left. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant it, slowing it down to half speed? Is enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition yet again? You ever see those professional demolitions where they set the charges on certain floors and you hear pop, pop, pop? Well, when I heard that friggin' noise, that's when I saw the building coming down. What's he talking about? Let's take a look at the South Tower on the right, a known controlled demolition on the left. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? I thought the terrorists planted explosives somewhere in the building. That's how loud it was, a crackling explosive. Take a look at these gentlemen. Are they credible?
Floor by floor instead of...
It was if they had detonated. They were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
All the way down.
Well, we're told by NIST that the upper portion of the building here, in the case of the North Tower, drove the rest of the building down and then destroyed itself. This violates the laws of physics, where we have equal and opposite destruction when two bodies collide. Well, that's what's happening here. The upper body, lighter, weaker, is destroying itself in the first 4 seconds. After that, there is no section visible anywhere on any of the photos that you see driving the rest of the building down. It's been destroyed. What happens after that looks more like an eruption than the Tongan Sea in 2009, with upward, outward, arching streamers and trailed by thick white smoke clouds of these structural steel sections sent out laterally, these ejections in a 1,200-foot diameter. Yes, it's going straight down, but it's going out and down. It's a very explosive event. Take a look at the explosions from underneath. All the way around, like the fireman said, like a belt, all these explosions. Are we looking at a collapse, or are we looking at a series of hundreds of explosions? The debris pile is outside the perimeter of the World Trade Center boundary itself, 12 to 1,400 foot. The steel is completely broken up and distributed where? At the pile down below, as you would expect in a gravitational collapse? No, all around World Trade Center. That's where the steel is. Look at the nice, neat pile associated with Building 7. That's an implosion, a classic implosion, versus the very explosive event known as the Twin Towers. That's where all the steel is, outside the perimeter. Number 4, do we have ejections of building materials at the lower floors? These are called squibs in the controlled demolition industry. 20, 40, 60 stories down below the zone of destruction, we have these ejections, explosive ejections at 150, 100, 200 feet per second, some of them, clocked by physicists with pulverized building solids in these. So these are not puffs of air, as NIST suggests. How fast is the building coming down? Well, let's take a look and time it. 6 seconds. 10 seconds. In a dozen seconds, both of these buildings have been completely shattered, torn to the ground, fallen almost as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky. It's accelerating. It's not slowing down. It's not decelerating when it meets resistance, which is what the laws of physics tell us should have happened. It should have met 90,000 tons of resistance structural steel, and the more steel here in the exterior perimeter than there is glass. That's a lot of steel. It should have slowed it down. But what happened to that steel? Oh, it's meeting with the fate of feature number 6, total shattering of the structure down to its individual elements almost, perimeter and structural columns, completely dismembered, distributed around, ready, broken up, ready for loading and shipment, just like a controlled demolition is engineered to do. Also resulting in the lateral ejection of structural steel elements. What's causing these freely flying structural steel sections to be ejected laterally at 300 to 600 feet away? What you saw there were 4-ton structural steel sections ejected laterally at 80 miles an hour, landing 600 feet in every direction, trailed by thick white smoke clouds. Structural steel sections are not flammable. Where's the smoke clouds coming from? Think about this. We'll be showing you evidence here of thermite, an incendiary used by the military to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter. Regarding these lateral ejections, Look at the amount of energy that we're talking about here. It's enough energy to send a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles. Where's this energy coming from? Where are the floors? By the way, we have 110 floors, concrete, 4 inches to 8 inches thick in this building, each of them. They're not stacked up on the bottom like in a gravitational collapse. On the right, you see a gravitational collapse, like a pancaking collapse in Mexico. On the left, you see the World Trade Center tower, 2-3-story pile of twisted steel. Where is the 90,000 tons of concrete? What happened to it? As we look at feature number 9, the pulverization of concrete. It's missing at the bottom. Oh, here it is, pulverized in midair. 90,000 tons of concrete pulverized to a fine powder before it develops its gravitational potential energy and crashes on the ground and breaks up. It's not breaking up down there. What's pulverizing it? High energy explosives are the most likely scenario here, along with thermite. It's pulverizing to 100 micron particles of fine ash that came all the way up here to the West Village, but went from river to river across lower Manhattan in a 3 to 5 inch thick blanket. What did they find, by the way, in all of that powder? We'll be coming to it. What do the experts say? We have 100 structural engineers among the 3,000 signed on to the petition calling for a new investigation. Like William Rice, the prevailing theory would have us believe that each of the Twin Towers inexplicably collapsed upon itself while crushing all 287 massive columns on each floor while maintaining a near free-fall acceleration, as if the 80,000 tons or more of supporting structural steel underneath didn't even exist. David Scott, structural engineer, near free-fall collapse violates laws of physics. Hello? Wake up, people. Ron Brookman, structural engineer, doesn't look anything like a heat-induced gravitational collapse mechanism. Why did the collapse of the towers become inevitable? Why would all 110 stories drop straight down to the ground in 10 seconds? Fire protection engineer, Scott Granger, all 3 collapses were very uniform in nature, but natural collapses, due to unplanned events, are not uniform. Ed Muniak, the fires were weak. NIST reports that they confirm the steel temperatures were low, very low. And World Trade Center collapses have no resemblance to any other high-rise fire. Feature number 9, persistent heat. Where is this coming from? Well, we have extreme persistent heat in the pile. You can see by the material held in the jaws of the crab claw excavator that it's molten metal. Red hot steel being pulled from deep within the pile. This doesn't happen by office fires dripping from the molten steel. Literally molten steel, seeing the molten steel, uncovering red hot metal beams. Molten metal, molten steel at the heart of the tower's remains.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like lava.
From a volcano.
None of this evidence of extreme temperatures, none of this evidence of explosives was included in the NIST report or the earlier FEMA report. Even the structural engineer himself of the World Trade Center, Leslie Robertson, a river of steel flowing, he says. You can see it pouring out of the South Tower minutes prior to its collapse. It's not aluminum, it's not lead from batteries or aluminum from a jet plane, because they don't glow bright yellow in daylight conditions. FEMA documents partially evaporated steel beams. Doesn't happen in 500-degree fires or even 1,000-degree Fahrenheit fires. Does happen at beginning at about 4,000 degrees to partially evaporate steel. And FEMA included this in the metallurgical examination in May of 2002 in their Appendix C, but NIST threw out this report when they took over the investigation in 2002, and we don't see it today. But here it is, documenting never before observed intergranular melting, solid steel girder turning into Swiss cheese like you see there, rapid oxidation, sulfidation, liquid iron. That's 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Very well documented, but completely ignored by NIST, causing the steel to thin to razor sharpness. What can cause this? rapid oxidation, sulfidation. And we have NIST completely throwing this material out. And even jet fuel doesn't get that hot. It was 600 degrees according to the jet fuel manufacturer. So what can create these temperatures up to 2,500 degrees? The physics says we can tell the temperature by the color of the material, exceeding 2,500 degrees. So let's look and see what could have done that. Could it be thermite? Well, thermite, what is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
So now we have an answer to the mystery of thermite. Were used, it would explain the sulfur attack on the steel documented by FEMA early on. It would explain the extreme temperatures exceeding 2,800 degrees, and it would explain the molten iron, not steel, but molten iron, the byproduct of thermite. NIST did not test for explosives, they say, but others did, many of them, including the U.S. Geological Survey, which finds 10 tons of previously molten iron microspheres in all the World Trade Center dust. 10 tons of it. It was, according to R.J. Lee, formed during the event, not before, not after. Here's how thermite works. It releases thousands of sparks, but they're not sparks, they're molten iron. They form themselves into spheres because of the pressure and the surface tension of an aerosolized liquid. So Niels Harrit and others, a team of 8 scientists, find in all the World Trade Center dust, independently collected samples, nanothermite materials, red on one side, gray on the other. This is extremely important information. So you can find out all the mysteries of why this irrefutable evidence is just so important for the proof of controlled demolition, which is why there's the complete destruction of evidence in the largest crime scene in history, 400 truckloads a day sent to China for recycling before investigators could get their hands on it to do a proper investigation. And that's why we want you to learn more, because there's a lot more here than I can bring you in just a half an hour, as you can begin to tell here. That's why we've got to have the truth about 9/11, and we've got to have an investigation. Our petition goes to Congress. We've got draft legislation. It's the Bobby McIlvaine Act. It's inspired by Bob McIlvaine, who lost his son Bobby in explosions. And he knows the truth about 9/11. Most of the family members do. Few of them are standing up and speaking, like today, Matt Campbell from the UK will be here. I'd like to thank everybody for being so patient with me today. Thanks.